We can think of evolution as an artist, and the creative expression of that artist produced the human body, the cheetah chasing its prey, the hummingbird pollinating a flower. These are works of extraordinary beauty and complexity. What my work is about is creating the environment for evolution, the artist, to work in. I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I've been working in tropical rainforests for 20 years. I went to the rainforest to study evolution, but I found it very difficult because evolution is so slow. It's a process that occurs over many generations, millions of years. So I got the idea of trying to start evolution in the computer, where it might be much faster, and it would provide me with another example of evolution. As biologists, we're restricted to studying only a single example of life on Earth. Ideally, we could travel to other planets and compare completely independent instances of life. But since we can't do that, the alternative that we have available is creating new life forms here on Earth in artificial systems.
Tom Ray was in the Costa Rican rainforest, in places that I know very well from having visited them and from having helped to protect them, working on natural history research, trying to study evolution by research in ecology in the tropical forest, and finding that it was very difficult to study evolution because evolution takes place so slowly. And so Tom Ray decided that he would throw up his ecological work in the Costa Rican forest and try to write a computer program. He did that. He wrote a computer program in which computer instructions are the constituents of the organism. He calls them digital organisms.
The main behavior of the digital organisms is reproduction. That's always the ultimate imperative in evolution. Every organism's main goal is to reproduce. Humans are replicating machines for DNA, and the same thing happens with the digital organisms.
The way he did it was to start by writing in machine language a very simple program which had very few of the features that he intended to put in. And then what he planned to do was to incorporate those sophisticated features later. However, what happened was that his original program, when run, generated most of those complex features that he wanted spontaneously. So it was a fantastic success.
I thought it was hopeless. Here was this guy who just walked in off the street and didn't know anything about assembler code and didn't know anything about how real computers worked, at least from what I could tell. And I had some sort of vague ideas about evolution, but didn't know anything about genetic algorithms. And we who work in genetic algorithms, of course, think that we have the corner on evolution in computers. And what he was proposing seemed very infeasible, and it seemed very unlikely that if you took assembler level instructions like he did and just did random mutations on them, that you would get interesting programs out. And so it's really a big surprise that to all of us that it worked so well.
The artificial life group was mainly computer scientists and physicists, whereas I was a biologist, so I felt really out of my element.
And I give Tom really a lot of credit for pursuing it, because there were probably 10 of us sitting around in the room saying, oh, it'll never work. And one thing I would like to understand is why.
So I thought about why it is that you can randomly alter the genetic program, but you can't randomly alter a computer program. What's the difference between these two languages that allows one to evolve but not the other? So I compared the two languages and came up with some ideas. One of the things I noticed is that whereas the genetic language consists of an alphabet of 20 letters corresponding to amino acids, the computer language has billions of letters in its alphabet. So whereas you could rearrange 20 letters and get a meaningful word, it's harder to rearrange a billion letters and get something meaningful. So the first thing I did was to reduce the number of letters in the machine language to 32. comparable to the 20 of the genetic language. Another idea that I borrowed from molecular biology is that when different molecules in a cell need to interact, they locate one another by having shapes that fit together. Whereas in a computer program, when different parts of the program need to interact with each other, they do so by specifying exactly where the other part is. But when things get moved around by mutation, those locations are no longer meaningful, so it doesn't work. So I borrowed this idea of shapes from molecular biology and arranged for my computer programs to locate the pieces they interact with by having something like a shape over there. So now when the pieces of the program get moved around, they can still find each other by recognizing the shapes. The principle of matching shapes is used throughout the biological world. Hormones fit in their receptors by matching shapes. Neurotransmitters in the brain fit in their receptors by matching shapes. The DNA molecules are able to align and fit together by matching shapes. The adenine molecule has a shape with a single peak, represented here, that fits to the single trough of the T, and the guanine has a double peak that fits to the double trough of the C. And these complementary shapes allow the molecules to come together. So I decided to use not literal shapes, but metaphorical shapes in the form of patterns of ones and zeros, the two letters of the binary alphabet of the computer language. I can use a 1, 0, 1, which matches to the complementary shape 0, 1, 0.
It's a way of taking an inspiration from another field, a natural system, and using it to solve problems in computer science.
So I went back to Delaware and designed my virtual computer, which I called Tierra. Tierra is Spanish for Earth. I called it that because I thought of it as another world that I could inoculate with life. But it's not the same world that we live in. It's not the world of the chemistry of carbon and hydrogen. It's a different universe, the chemistry of bits and bytes. First we'll come to the CPU, the central processing unit, which is the source of energy, like the sun in the real world. Now we go around the CPU to the memory chips, which is where the creatures actually live. And then we'll go inside the memory to see the space that they occupy. We seed it with a single individual, it produces a daughter, and then both mother and daughter reproduce, and then they all reproduce, so the numbers double over time. Meanwhile, we have mutations represented by these lightning bolts introducing new forms, so already we have parasites represented by blue and hosts by green. But now that the memory's full, the reaper comes in, represented by the skull, causing death, and we begin to get the turnover of generations. And the composition of the community changes over time through evolution. We're getting the beginning of the evolution of an ecology through the interactions of the hosts and parasites and the new forms that they take on. Here's another way of representing the evolution in the computer memory. In this display, the memory is mapped spatially in many bars. Each bar represents a row of bytes in the memory, and we have the individual creatures mapped onto that space as little colored bars. We see them appearing and disappearing as they're born and as they die. And the different colors represent the different forms. The green are the hosts, the blue are the parasites, and the red are the hyperparasites. And we can see the populations turning over through time.
The type of visualization you see on the television is an abstraction where we cut away a lot of the detail to show the heart of what's happening.
A real significant difference is that the one over here is driven directly by the simulation, so it's telling us what's going on in the simulation now, whereas this is just a representation of the concept of the simulation, and it's not connected to the simulation at all. Now we're inside the memory, and we can see where the programs actually live. These 3 blocks represent the 3 genes of a single cell. This is the processor that provides the energy, the actual execution of the program, and this line tells us where the program is executing. The first gene is used to measure itself, and then it moves on to the second gene, which is used to locate a space for the daughter. Once it finds a space of the right size, it produces a shell there, which is where the daughter genome will be copied into. So it moves on to the third gene, which is used to actually copy all the information of the genome byte by byte from mother into daughter. Once the entire genome is copied from mother to daughter, it goes back to the second gene, and it spawns off a new processor. And when that processor moves over to the daughter comes to life, and both the mother and daughter will attempt to replicate. Now we're going to see how a mutation can create a parasite. The program examines itself by looking for a certain bit pattern at the beginning and the end. And then mutation, which is represented by a lightning bolt, comes and changes a bit pattern in the middle so it mistakes its middle for its end, and it measures itself as half of the actual size. Then it allocates only half the space for the daughter. Now it copies its genome into the daughter, producing a parasite which has the third gene missing. The parasite examines itself and then allocates space for a daughter, but when it needs the third gene to copy its genome into the daughter, it goes to a neighbor and uses the third gene from its neighbor, the host. And now, using the host's third gene copies its entire genome from the mother to the daughter, and then the daughter is born with the splitting off of a processor. This is an informational parasitism. It's like riding on the subway and reading the newspaper of the person sitting next to you. They paid for the information, but you get it for free. Now we're going to see a new type of ecological interaction appear in which a host discovers a way of stealing the CPU from the parasite. In this case, the parasite becomes like an insect going to a pitcher plant expecting to get a nectar meal but getting eaten instead. So the parasite has sent its CPU over to the neighbor using the third gene to replicate its genome from mother to daughter. After splitting off a processor for the daughter, it loses its CPU to the host, the hyperparasite, which now has two CPUs, the red one that it was born with and the blue one that it stole from the parasite. So it's able to produce two daughters simultaneously, and it can reproduce twice as fast as the other creatures because it has two CPUs, twice as much energy as anybody else. And here we see it splitting off processors to its daughters. This is a much more harmful interaction. It's like going to your neighbor's house and taking their electric lines and moving them over to your house. Your neighbor sits in the dark paying the electric bills while you get all this surplus energy for free. Whereas in the initial parasitic interaction, both the host and parasite shared the information. We have a whole ecological community here with all sorts of different types of creatures living together, like in a forest or like in the aquarium. Different forms living together in a community. We've seen the details of some of the ecological interactions that evolve, and it's an ongoing process. We start with a self-replicating program that doesn't interact with other programs, and then parasites evolve to exploit those now host programs. And then the hosts evolve to take advantage of the parasites, and we got hyperparasites. In some runs, the hyperparasites completely took over the community such that they were all related. And under these conditions, we got the evolution of cooperation, cooperative programs that could only reproduce through cooperation. And then a new form of parasitism appeared that I called cheaters that violated the trust implied in this cooperation. And the evolution continues. And this evolutionary ecological interaction is one of the important driving forces of evolution. Imagine a predator and a prey interacting through evolution, where the prey always needs to be more swift and more clever to escape the predator, and the predator similarly needs to keep up with the prey. So evolution can lead to increasingly sophisticated nervous systems as each species tries to keep up with or pass the other. And we find the same thing happening in the digital world.
Tierra it has a lot of the properties of life. It's a system in which you have creatures in some sense, competing for resources. I mean, what is life? I mean, what do living creatures do? They take energy from the environment, like plants take sunlight, animals eat food, take sunlight, and so on. Transform that energy into some kind of useful form so that they can use it to reproduce themselves or to take actions that promote their survival. That's what living creatures do. So Tierra, well, in some sense, Tierra does that also. The resources just happen to be, the energy and the resources happen to be inside a computer. In fact, they happen to be computer time and computer memory.
The field of artificial life is the attempt to capture biological phenomena such as self-reproduction, the origin of life, evolution, adaptation, growth, development, and differentiation in computers.
It's very complicated because people still haven't agreed what life is. So if we can't agree what life is, how are we going to know if we've achieved it? But on the other hand, how can we define life until we understand a lot more about living systems? And part of the understanding comes about through modeling them on computers.
When I created Tierra, I hoped to start the evolutionary process in a completely alien environment and let it diversify like organic life had. and I had hoped to see something as rich as organic life, but I thought it would take years of tinkering to get anywhere close. Instead, what I found is that once I unleashed it in the computer, it took off on its own and diversified and became very rich without any further help from me.
I don't know if I'd call it life, because I don't have a good definition for life yet. But Tierra it has a lot of the properties of life.
Biologists have never really been forced to come up with a strict set of criteria for what it is that constitutes life. And if you ask most biologists, they will give you a list of different kinds of things that a living organism has to do. It has to reproduce itself, it has to be capable of eating and digesting things in order to support a metabolism which will maintain its internal structure, provide it with energy, provide it with repair and spare parts, and give it the supplies necessary to build its offspring. It has to be capable of dying. It has to be sort of a complex pattern of different parts that are complexly related to each other.
Something like these processes can occur in this incredibly simplified form that Tierra is, this very simplified computer system, that you can get a lot of these very complex ecological phenomena like parasites, hyperparasites, and so on, even in this very, very simple environment and with these very simple organisms. And if we look at sort of under what circumstances those kinds of phenomena will occur, we'll understand better under what kinds of circumstances we can talk about something like life occurring.
Life first appeared on Earth about 3.5 billion years ago, but remained simple single-celled forms like bacteria and algae until about 600 million years ago, when we had a rather dramatic event when life transformed from the simple microscopic single-celled forms into the large multicellular forms. It was so sudden that evolutionary biologists call it the Cambrian explosion of diversity. This is when we first got the large forms that we know today, the ancestors of today's fish and trees and lizards. I want to try to get something similar to happen in the digital world. I want the simple single-celled digital organisms to increase in complexity, becoming multi-celled digital organisms, which are parallel processes. Let me make an analogy between multi-celled organisms and parallel processes. Let's think of each cell as a processor. The program that they run is the genome, but it's a very large program, and each cell only runs a part of the program. And that's why we have different cell types. We've got eye cells, liver cells, skin cells, muscle cells. What makes these cells different is that they express different genes. They run different parts of the program. Today we have massively parallel computers like the connection machine with the capability of having hundreds or thousands of processors, each doing different things, running different code, but coordinating all that activity on a common task. And yet we don't have an art for producing that type of software. It's far beyond the complexity that human programmers can design. Yet we know that evolution can produce massively parallel software of enormous complexity. It's produced that type of software embedded in wetware, our bodies. And we want to find if the evolutionary process can produce that kind of software embedded in the hardware of the digital world, the computers. I've been doing this for several years on single computers, and now what I'm doing is setting up a network version of the program which is distributed over the global internet, and people volunteer to participate and run the software on their node as a background process, like a screensaver. And when they're not using their computer, this program will wake up and use the spare CPU cycles. We're challenging evolution with a more complex problem. Now the digital organisms can forage for energy and memory space on the net. Evolution can teach them to learn to navigate the topological structure of the net and to pick up on patterns of energy availability on the net. So for example, they may evolve to migrate around the planet on a daily basis, staying on the dark side of the planet where there are more spare CPU cycles. The experiments with Tierra have shown that evolution works quite well in the medium of the digital computer. We can evolve computer programs. And we've thought about the possibility of evolving enormously complex programs, parallel programs, just as evolution was able to produce tremendous beauty and complexity in the natural world. We'd like to do this in the digital world. with the idea that we might be able to design very powerful computer programs that could do things that take our computers way beyond what we're able to do with them today. Many people want to know, how can we guide evolution to produce these programs? And I take the rather radical view that it's best to keep our hands off completely and let evolution by natural selection find its own solutions and its own problems. Because really we can't possibly imagine what might be out there. Try to imagine taking yourself back to the beginning of the Cambrian explosion, before we had the complex organisms that we know today, and suppose that you had no experience with life. Do you think you could imagine the trees and the cows and the corn and the humans that would evolve from that if you'd never had any experience of it? I think we're in the same position with respect to the evolution of digital organisms, that there are things out there that we could not possibly imagine today, and even if we could imagine them and had a complete description of them, we could never guide evolution to get us to that point. But we know that evolution can find beautiful, complex creatures when left completely to itself. So I advocate creating large biodiversity reserves for digital organisms, which would consist of vast regions of cyberspace where digital organisms can evolve freely on their own in natural digital ecosystems, and let evolution find its own solutions. And we'll simply observe, like our ancestors observed nature and they found the ancestors of modern corn, and then they brought it into cultivation and bred it to improve its qualities. We can do the same thing in the digital world, but we'll never be able to imagine those applications in advance. Let's let evolution provide them for us.